So, Mark chapter 1, that's where we're going to kick off today. And if you know my preaching, we won't just stay in Mark chapter 1, but that does give us the basis for what we're going to be talking about today. We're in this series that we started last week called Soul Rest. If you missed last week, again, you don't have to get them all together for it to make sense. You will get something out of this even if you missed last week. But I do encourage you to go back on YouTube and Facebook. We put our sermons up there so that you can kind of have a full picture by the end of it of what it means to have soul rest, why we need it. I got to admit, there was a long time that phrase didn't really do anything for me. I didn't understand why I needed it or if I had it or not. But it is something that has been weighing on my heart and in my life. And I want to make sure that I before I preach anything, make sure that you understand that I'm not there yet. There's a lot of things, like one of the reasons I was so looking forward to preach Romans this past fall is because I love Romans, and I've read through Romans, and I feel like I've got a decent handle on Romans. But this whole idea of soul rest was foreign to me. And so as I'm preaching to you, know that God has been preaching this to me, and I'm right there along with you. I'm certainly not looking down my, remember you have a grandpa or a teacher look down their bifocals at you and you knew you were in trouble? It's not what I'm doing. If you feel conviction in your heart today, know that I've probably felt that same conviction. I'm probably under it right now. But my desire in 2020 is for us to have soul rest. I get that phrase from the words of Jesus when he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary, heavy burdened, or heavy laden, and you will find rest for your soul." He says, "Take my yoke," which most of us don't know what that means, but take my teachings, take my burden, and realize that it's light. And that what Jesus has for us is something that if you're a believer, you should be able to carry and not feel like it's weighing you down. And so I've seen far too many Christians, myself being one of them, that I go, this doesn't feel light. These expectations, these burdens that I feel like come with being a Christian are heavy. And I don't think I'm doing this right. And then I read that verse, and I read it, and it's popped up in sermons all throughout 2019 because God's going, something's not quite right. You need to have a lighter burden. You need to have a lighter yoke. And so that's my goal for this series. And so last week we started by saying, all right, we're going to identify the enemy. And so hopefully those of you that saw or were here, you went ahead and went to war with, we pointed out 3 particular enemies that will stop you from having soul rest. Those being idols, distraction, and passivity. And it basically the whole sermon, I could have saved y'all about 30 minutes last week if I just read to you this verse, 1 John 5:21, that captures it perfectly. Dear children, keep away from anything that might take God's place in your hearts. That's a pretty simple phrase, but it's not so simple to do. To keep away from anything that might take place of God in your hearts. And one of the things that stuck out the most was the smartphone. I talked a little bit about how one of my idols tends to be the smartphone. I meant to keep it with me. I usually get it out of the pulpit because I don't need it to be here while I'm preaching. But my smartphone, for I think a lot of us in our generation, has become an idol. And so one of the things that I want us to do today is talk about how to dethrone your phone. How to take your phone off and by the way, some of you already are going to cut me out because you're like, I don't like my phone. Some of y'all, this is newfangled technology. But by the way, I was just thinking this morning about, let's say someone traveled this is where my mind goes when I should be praying, by the way. I was praying for our church, and then all of a sudden I started thinking about what if a time traveler came here from the 1970s and said, so what are you guys, everybody doing? And well, we tend to look at our phones a lot. Can you imagine like somebody with shag carpet and a rotary dial phone, and they're just like, oh, I forgot my phone. And then they take it with them, and it's ridiculous. But in the even since 2007, since the advent of the smartphone, that has changed everything. And so one of the things that we need to do to get to, I think there's 4 parts to having soul rest. And one of them is silence and solitude. And one of the biggest enemies of silence and solitude in our lives is that daggum little brick we keep in our pocket, right? Because we go to it naturally. And by the way, this is not, I read this stat, it's probably much higher now, but in 2014 they took a poll and 77% of young adults, that's their first thing that they do. When their mind is not preoccupied on something else, they reach for their phone. How many of y'all do that? You don't have to raise your hand, just nod at me. Just while I'm exchange that knowing look, because I know, because I see you, right? It doesn't even have to be when you're not engaged. Some of y'all pick it up, myself included, in the middle of a conversation. You're like, I've gotten to where now I'll just stop and go, oh, wait. Are you done? Okay, now we can continue to talk. It's just become a thing that we do by force of habit. But, the studies are starting to roll in. People a lot smarter than I are starting to study the results. And since that first iPhone came out, there's a huge uptick in depression and anxiety and loneliness. You would think, I've got 1,000 friends on Facebook, but yet we're still lonely. There's a big drop in literacy. There's a big drop in physical health and social well-being. And I'm not blaming it all on the smartphone, but there's a correlation there. That smartphone has changed some things. And so let me just say before we get into it, this is not going to be an anti-tech rant, right? I love me some technology. In fact, the reason that my phone is not up there with me is because it's using it to live stream the video, okay? And so I love it. I use it for ministry. I use it for personal life. I use it for business. But I'm saying that it does not need to be on the throne of our hearts, that only one person deserves to be on the throne of our hearts. And so if that's not a problem for you this morning, don't tune me out, because the odds are somebody that you know and love is struggling with this. And again, we are supposed to be a group of people that look a little bit different than the world around us. And so I want us to ask ourselves, how do we dethrone our phone? And my hope is out of that, that you'll discover this weird thing called silence and solitude. For those of y'all that weren't here last week, I did this really weird thing. I ended the service. I said, okay, nobody's going to play any music. I'm going to finally shut up, and I'm going to let God speak to you. And that was the longest 3 minutes of my life. I was sitting there in the back, and I'm doing my thing, but I'm going, it's really quiet in here. I could see after about a minute, everybody's like, so what are we doing? It was very weird. But it's weird because we don't do that anymore, do we? We always have something to distract us, to get our attention. And so I want to look today at Mark chapter 1, and I want to look specifically at the way of Jesus. Again, I mentioned this earlier. I want to look at the truths of Jesus, but let's look at the way of Jesus. So if you have a Bible, read along. If not, it's going to be on the screen. I want to read you a couple verses. In Mark chapter 1, beginning with verse 35. It says, before daybreak the next morning. Now, Jesus had just got done. This was one of his first big days of ministry. So he has healed the sick. He has done it's been just an impactful day. And so the next morning, Jesus got up and he went out to an isolated place to pray. Later, Simon and the others went out to find him. And when they found him, they said, everyone's looking for you. Have you ever been there? You just want to get away for a few minutes? Hey, we need your, hey, show me. Come here, I need your attention. They were doing that to Jesus as well. But Jesus replied, we must go on to other towns as well, and I will preach to them too. That's why I came. So he traveled throughout the region of Galilee, preaching in the synagogues and casting out demons. Now, I've read through that. In fact, we did in our Wednesday night groups for a while before we did community groups. We went through the book of Mark, and I think I blew probably right through that. Because that's it's just details about what Jesus was doing. But it's very telling the action that Jesus took here. And so one of the things, if you're going to dethrone your phone, if you're going to eventually get to having rest for your soul, number one, you need to prioritize God's presence. You need to make God's presence a priority in your life. Do not let the lure of the screen distract you from the presence of God, because there's so many alternatives. Pick your poison, right? I thought I was bad because, man, Facebook and Instagram get a lot of my attention. But then there's Snapchat and TikTok and Weeble Wobble or whatever you guys are into. That's just what I made up. It's probably going to be one pretty soon. But you got podcasts, you got news, you got games that you can always have with you and are always in your presence. And again, they're not bad things in and of themselves, but we have to put the presence of God before all of that. Right? 1 Corinthians 6:12 is a good principle to apply. You say I'm allowed to do anything, but not everything is good for you. And even though I'm not allowed to do anything, I must not become a slave to anything. You want to know how I know that you might be becoming a slave to something? when you accidentally leave your phone somewhere and see how long it takes for you to have a mental breakdown. But they could be calling me. Oh, but I can't. And I've seen some of y'all get visibly discomforted because you don't have your phone with you. Now imagine if we had that same reaction to the presence of God. When we went, because of my lack of attention or my own willing sinfulness, man, I've got myself out of the presence of God. I better get back to it. But we don't really, it's weeks, isn't it? Sometimes you go, man, I hadn't read my Bible. I haven't prayed once. Man, I've been out of the presence of God. And it's not a big deal. That's how I know that we don't prioritize God's presence. It's the new normal for you to be spending hours and hours staring at a screen. But let me just be real. Forget normal. We're not supposed to be normal. God tells us we should not be normal. In fact, Romans 12:2 says, don't copy the behavior and customs of the world. Let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. By the way, it's difficult to let God change the way you think if you never think about God. Our phones have changed the way we think. The studies say that we now have less of an attention span than a goldfish. The goldfish's attention span is 9 seconds. I think we're at a solid 8 before the average human being. It's changing the way we think. Other things are doing that. Why not let God change the way you think, right? By the way, that you should just know that this is a part of the plan. This is all planned. Mark Zuckerberg just went, what? People are addicted to Facebook? I didn't have any idea. No. In fact, there's a lot of people leaving these big tech companies, whether it be social media or Apple or whatever products, and they're starting to come out and say, yeah, we met with psychologists and we figured out how to manipulate your brain. We figured out how to trigger the same dopamine hits in your brain that it's almost like doing cocaine when you get a like. When you get again, look at one of those, red notifications on Facebook or Instagram. Try not checking one of those for 24 hours. You got to have that hit of dopamine. Ooh, they like my this. Oh, they do that. Oh, I've got to this level of this on this game. It's all meant to trigger more and more of your attention. Why? Because the more attention we have, the more money they make. They're not interested in you having a well-balanced life. They're trying to make some money off of you. Right? And in fact, I heard this phrase. It's very apt for today. But this Catholic author said, we are distracting ourselves into spiritual oblivion. By the way, he said that in 1999. Imagine now, because all that tech we had back in the 90s, right? Those digipets are really just distracting us. Or whatever else we had back then. But the point is, though, where is your attention going? Whose presence are you letting into your life? So what do we replace it with? One of the popular verses in our church recently has been Philippians 4:8. Fix your thoughts on what's true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about those things that are excellent and worthy of praise. By the way, if your phone is doing that, by all means. Whenever your phone leads you to think about those type of things, use it. But more than likely, that's not always the case, is it? More than likely, it does something else. But this is a spiritual habit. This is a spiritual muscle that we have to develop. We have to change our default. We need a new default when it comes to up here and whose presence that we're in. Jesus knew that. Look at what Luke 5:16 says. It says, Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. I went through and was shocked at the amount of times that the Gospels presented that fact. I always wondered why we got so much detail about certain things, but not about other things, about what Jesus did. But one of the things that God felt the need for us to understand was that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places to pray, because he knew Psalm 16:11 was true, that in God's presence there is the fullness of joy. Not a cheap distraction from the joy that you wish you had, but in God's presence there is the fullness of joy, where you lack nothing, where you have everything that your soul needs. And I know some of you are like, listen, you're already making arguments in your head. You know how I know that? Because I made arguments in my head too. When I started reading these and started feeling this conviction, I'm like, well, when I've had a bad day, I don't want to think about what I just went through. I just need that TV show or that social media to distract me from all the bad that's going on in my life. And I get it. Some of y'all's lives right now are rough. You're going through a hard time, and you just need something to make you feel happy again. But again, what are we leaning on to the answer? Hebrews 4:16 says, let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace. That's where God's sitting, by the way, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in times of need. When you're having a bad day, the best solution for that is for you to get in the presence of God. For you to put away all the distractions, all the jealousy that you get on social media. And by the way, y'all do know that your friend's Instagram feed is not an accurate depiction of their real life. That's the highlights. That's the angles that they want you to see. And we end up getting jealous. We end up going, man, I'm just missing out. And God's sitting right there going, I could give you everything that you need if you would just get out of your phone's presence and get into my presence. And so important for us to prioritize that. By the way, Jesus, who did not sin, who knew no sin, thought it was a good idea for him to get in the presence of God. Don't you think we should too? If Jesus went to lonely places often to pray, don't you think that would be a good idea for us to pick up on? So prioritize God's presence. And when you do that, you'll dethrone your phone. Another thing that you need to do that will help with this is to embrace your limitations. We need to embrace our limitations. We need to understand that we were never meant to see, do, and have it all. And by the way, you do this, you start to feel real freedom. I know that that's opposite from what we've been told. We've been told that to have freedom, you need to have more choices. And you need to have more, but trust me, more choices does not equal more freedom. We need to understand that God has made us a certain way to where we have limitations. We misapply stuff like Philippians 4:13, right? That says, what does it say? So I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Yeah, well, you can, but that doesn't mean God wants you to, right? That doesn't mean you don't have limitations. We got to fight this urge to be omnipresent. Our phones think we can do that. Well, I can keep tabs on everybody. I can see what they're up to. And God's going, you need to embrace the moment. There's so many times, I looked out, I was eating out the other night, and I saw about 10 other tables in my purview, and at least 70% of them, there was somebody talking, and the other one was on their phone. I'm like, oh, you're missing a moment. We were at a nice restaurant. There was good food. There was a moment to be soaked up. And we have lost the ability to soak up a moment and really live it like God intends us to. It's a beautiful thing for us to have the limitations that God has given us. We were never meant to know all the things that God knows and do all the. You're never going to be able to travel to all the places in the world, right? My Google Chromecast makes me jealous. Now, if you ever use Chromecast, but it puts up these big, nice pictures of like Tahiti and all these waterfalls and deserts and mountains. And every time I turn on my TV here in Siler City, North Carolina, I go, oh, I wish I was there. Oh, that looks cool. Probably never experienced that. But God's like, hold on now. I've got limitations put in, but they're for your good. And you need to stop worrying about being satisfied in all these other things and be satisfied in Him. And that's the promise that our smartphone gives us, is that we get to see it all and do it all. But there's some good limits. A couple things I want you to understand. You're limited in your productivity. You're limited in the things that you can accomplish. Some of y'all are those type A's that you got to get everything done on your to-do list, right? And if you don't, you can't sleep at night. Oh, I didn't get a chance to do this. But we are limited. More is not always better. I've had to realize that because every time I spend a little bit of time investing in my business that's separate from the church, I go, man, I could have been doing this. I could have been doing that. And God's like, yeah, you could, but I got something for you over here. And so sometimes God limits our productivity because He wants us to understand that the world doesn't need us to be super productive all the time. That the world will keep spinning if you don't get your to-do list done. By the way, some of y'all, that's not a problem, and I'm actually getting you to do some of your to-do list is a little more of an issue. But for those of you that can't, more is not always better. We're also limited in our attention, right? We can't watch every TV show. We can't see and do everything. Jenna's reading a really good book. I think the author is Lisa Turkhurst. Don't ask me how to spell it. I have no idea. But it's a good book. It's called The Best Yes. The Best Yes. And the idea is that you got to say no to a lot of good things to be able to say yes to the best thing. That there is something that the Spirit of God, if you are a believer, is going to say, this is what I want from you today. And you need to say no to this, and no, they all seem very good, but I don't want that for you because you only have a limited amount of attention. You have to do that when you figure out what TV shows you're going to watch, when you figure out how you're going to spend your evening and your day off, because there's only a certain amount of attention that you have. And sometimes something is not worth your attention. Jesus was practicing that in our verses here. Look back at Mark 1, and he said, everyone's looking for you. Now, would it have been bad for Jesus to go back to those people and minister to them more? No, not in and of himself. Jesus did a lot of good, and so the people were like, oh, we need some more of that. And yet Jesus knew, why? Because Jesus was fully God, but he was also fully man. And he was limited by only a certain amount of attention. And he says, you know what? God's telling me I need to go over here now. You're going to have to make the same decisions because you can't do it all. You have limited attention. This one's going to make you mad, though. You have limited entertainment. We don't like that because I was trying to total up the numbers this morning and I ran out of time. But Netflix has got, I think it would take you like 3 or 5 years to watch everything on Netflix if they never added another thing to it. You're never going to be able to keep up. You're never going to be able to entertain yourselves to death. The other day I saw, I won't tell you whose kid it was. Actually, it wasn't mine for once. A lot of y'all go, all right, which one is he making an example of now? No, this is actually, for once, wasn't my kid. But I was around a kid who told their parent, I'm bored. Y'all, now parents, you've heard that. Like, I'm bored. Listen, any of y'all that does not remember a time where there was not an internet, you can't say I'm bored. Right? That's a whole different ball game there. But this kid had the TV on, had a tablet in their hand, had toys strewn all around the room, and yet they were still bored. Because we'll never be able to entertain ourselves into soul rest. We'll never be able to entertain ourselves in such a way that it will replace the presence of God. There's only a certain amount of entertainment that we can enjoy. And I know y'all get FOMO, fear of missing out. You don't want to miss out on anything. Oh, someone's talking about that show. I got to binge all 400 episodes of that just so I'll know. You can't do that. There's better things that we can put our attention on. So we have to embrace our limitations. And we do that when we understand that we're resting in Jesus' finished work. That God does not depend on us getting and attaining these certain things in order for us to be happy. When you embrace your limitations, you're not worried about it. You're like, you know what? God didn't have that for me today. I'm not ever going to be able to do all of this, and I don't have to. And that's when you start to understand what it means to have rest for your soul. But the last thing that will help us do this is, number 3, we have to wield it wisely. We have to wield these smartphones, these devices, these screens. We have to wield it wisely. I don't want to categorically come up here and say, smartphones are bad, get rid of them. That's not what I'm saying. We just need to use it wisely. Because, by the way, I gave God permission a couple weeks ago. I said, Lord, do you want to take the smartphone from me? Because I'm realizing I don't need it. And I may go through withdrawals and be out of it for a week, but I'll get through it. And God did not take that away. He may take that away from you. We have to make sure that we are wielding it wisely. Obviously, technology is a good thing. It's a good gift from God. The principle that we need to apply here that Jesus gives us in the parable of the shrewd manager, and at the end of that in Luke chapter 16, verse 9, he comes to this conclusion. He says, use your worldly resources to benefit others and make friends. And then when your possessions are gone, they will welcome you into an eternal home. Look, use whatever is at your disposal to bless other people, to benefit others, to glorify God, right? 1 Corinthians 10:31 says, whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. So if you can take that smartphone, if you can take that tablet, if you can take that fill-in-the-blank technology and wield it wisely, use it for good, then do it. That's why, again, I'm preaching from an iPad. I definitely, I'm not going to say you can't use your iPad, but use your iPad to, read the Bible and not look at porn, right? There's a big difference in how you use it. You can use it wisely or you can use it foolishly. So, there's good things, right? There's good things you can do with that. There's a thing called a Bible app. It's wonderful. You can take the Bible with you wherever you go. That's a good way to use it. We are using the Read Scripture app that has little videos on understanding the Bible. That's how our church is going through the Bible in a year. There's reminders. You can set reminders on your phone to help go, hey, pray for so-and-so. Hey, call so-and-so and check on them. I do that all the time because life's busy. And we say, oh, I should have done that. Well, there's a good way you can use technology to benefit others, to text and call, initiate conversations, reach out to people that are lonely. So use that tech for good. Just don't use it to distract you from the moment, from those relationships that you should be investing in. Don't choose entertainment over God's presence. Don't get involved in social media. People say stuff on social media they'd never say to your face. Have you noticed that? You get real bold behind that screen, don't you? Right? And you get real judgy behind that screen too. Don't use it unwisely. Wield it for the good of God and for the good of other people around you. And so the main idea is if we do these things, we end up in this weird place. We make room for silence and solitude. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, funnily enough, on social media this week. So, again, if you missed that, that's okay. I understand. But if you're wielding social media wisely, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about introducing this idea of silence and solitude where we pick out some time and we shut everything else off and we get alone with God. Psalm 27:4 really shapes this because this is King David, and he says, the one thing that I ask of the Lord, the thing I seek the most, more than blessings, more than wisdom. His son Solomon asked for wisdom, and that did a whole lot more than his things. I want to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, delighting in the Lord's perfections and meditating in his temple. Just being with God. This is unheard of to some of us because there's always something that they're wanting us to do and be and understand. Sometimes God's led me to turn off a sermon. I was listening to a sermon, and God's like, shh, cut that off. Listen to me. Listen to my voice. And so today, as we end up, we're going to have one more song. JC's going to come on up here. But my goal for you is to find some time in your week to have silence and solitude. To dethrone your phone off of your mind. It's going to take some work. It's going to take some uncomfortableness. It's going to take you doing, what I did is I moved where I set my phone at night so that I can't reach it. That's one helpful if you are one of those that likes to turn the alarm off and go back to sleep. Yeah, that was me, right? So part of it was that, but I realized that there are certain things that we can do to invite God's presence in. One of the things I included in your booklet was the common rule here, and it talks about just shutting your phone off for a little bit. And again, not condemning anyone. I had someone last night. I was at dinner, and one of y'all was texting me about tomorrow, and I texted you back, and the guy was like, "Oh, you're on your phone? Weren't you talking about how you are supposed to be on your phone?" Don't be a phone Nazi. Don't be someone that, right? We need to understand that it's not about rules. It's not about regulations. It's about you getting in the presence of God. And so what we're going to do right now is as we end today in worship, I want you to think about what you need to do, because I don't know your life. I don't know what you got going on, but I do know that you need more of the presence of God. You're like, Ben, I get in the presence of God. Good. Do it more. Can't be a bad thing, can it? But I think a lot of us will find that we're not giving God a chance to work. We're not giving him a chance to speak because we've prioritized the presence of something else instead of him.